Good afternoon, everybody. My presentation, as you can see, is a case study of a project that we in the Professional Services Group recently undertook. The project is migrating a customer's open VMS application to Windows and to host that application on the cloud. I'm actually going to show you my final slide first. It's easy with a little help from Synergex Professional Services Group. How easy? PSG recently is currently involved with 3 active open VMS-to-Windows projects. One has recently gone live, while 2 others are in progress. That's on top of other PSG projects we've had in 2018. This is possible because of the tools available and the experience of our team. While 2 of the 3 customers with a more traditional migration route, which is to a physical Windows server, the one in the presentation I'm about to give you chose to deploy their development and production servers to the cloud. So let's see what it takes to migrate to the cloud. A little bit of background. This customer is a manufacturer and distributor in the food industry. They have multiple plants in North America, and their application is used by over 300 users. Most are typical users accessing, one company's site, but a small number of the users are what we consider super users that require access to data from multiple plants. In addition, the code is modified to run slightly different in each of their 3 regions. The application is character cell based, they have no repository, and the application calls some open VMS routines, mostly for sorting. The application also uses a number of DCL command procedures, both generated within the application as well as pre-written COM files used to support the application. This application is also enhanced with a separate SQL database, allowing for ad hoc reporting as well as for faxing capabilities. Just an FYI, this customer sends about 400 faxes a day, most of them to their suppliers, so they're heavy users of the faxing capabilities. So project planning is obviously important and a good first place to start. Prior to starting the migration, PSG and the customer prepared a plan that included an aggressive go-live date for the first plant. That was about 6 months after the project kickoff. Subsequent go-lives were planned every month over the next year until all 30 plus of their plants were live on the Windows platform. For PSG, planning for the migration included creating and gathering the tools put in our toolbox. Many of these tools have actually been shown in not only this year's, but in prior years' presentations, so it should be familiar to you. This includes our VMS compatibility library that allows for calling of common VMS routines in a Windows environment, the libharu assembly for PDF creation and printing, as well as Git for both source control and trouble tracking. For the project, PSG provided a small team of experienced developers and project management, complemented with a small team from the customer. As is normal with most PSG projects, the team held stand-up meetings throughout the week, as well as weekly progress reports. Planning on the customer side included providing their source code, obviously, and assigning major milestones to both their internal and external resources. The customer team members included management, business analysts, as well as an outside consultant familiar with their application. Once we had these in place, we agreed on the milestones, and since the customer identified a go-live date, we took that date and worked backwards to ensure that we completed the planned milestones to meet their date. A major part of the planning process is determining costs, both project costs and long-term costs. We had to decide whether the customer or PSG would be responsible for the various milestone items. To help reduce the project costs, the customer may decide to take on some of the milestones. However, a couple of the things to consider is that customer involvement has a cost. You might think, oh, well, it's free, I've got the personnel to do it, it's not going to cost me anything. But the cost on the customer side can be the fact that they're not only responsible for getting this project going, but they've got day-to-day tasks also. Also, time has a cost. The longer it drags out, the more expensive the project becomes, and there's actually a lost opportunity cost with it going very long. So if that is something that you're considering, don't just look at it from the standpoint of, my guys are fixed costs. There's actually a cost involved as they are on that project and off of their day-to-day tasks. Long-term costs include the initial and ongoing costs of the cloud servers. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the cost of cloud servers, but they do run the gamut. It could be several hundreds of dollars a month, if not more, depending on how you configure it. This can be partially offset by potential reduced costs in maintaining cloud servers versus in-house servers. As you saw with Richard's presentation, it's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to maintain your cloud servers from a single website. So planning also includes selecting your cloud vendor. Our customer happily chose Azure due to its various offerings, expandability, as well as the fact that Synergex has prior experience with Azure. Other cloud vendors will probably work just fine. A major consideration when migrating from a terminal-based server, such as what our customer has, to a Windows-based access is that you have a sufficiently large pipe to the internet. You got to ensure that you've got that large pipe to begin with, and be prepared as you're going through development and testing to expand it as soon as you see any performance issues. So far, luckily, we haven't seen performance issues, but the customer is well aware that if that's something that we need to expand on, then they're prepared to do that. Just like with PCs, where more memory is better, with cloud servers, bigger pipelines are better. When selecting a cloud vendor, price is obviously a consideration, and I already mentioned to you that depending on what type of cloud service you go with, it can be upwards of several $100s. You also need to consider, and I think Richard covered this in his presentation, the proximity of the cloud vendors' data centers. You want to make sure that they're reasonably centralized to the users that you're going to have using this system. As I mentioned earlier, this is a customer that's got plants all over the North America. They chose to use the data center on the West Coast simply because that's where a lot of the corporate office is there, and a lot of the processing also occurs there. Other considerations include instance sizing. You can choose an instance that may be too small when the end comes along. The nice thing about doing it as a cloud service is that it's not an insurmountable problem if you pick an instance that's too small. It's just a matter of going back to Azure, saying I need to bump up and get a bigger instance, and boom, it's there. So while instance sizing should definitely come into the planning process, it does give you the capability to add more CPUs, more memory, larger disk sizes if you need it. One thing about Azure, and I don't know whether this is true with other cloud vendors, you're limited to distinct instances of a server. So you can't just simply say, I want Xeon, blah, 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 8-core, hyper-threaded, machine with 128 gig of RAM. You have to pick specific instances that are available in that data center. And it is rare, but depending on the data center, some instances may not exist. So something to consider. Look at that early on in the process to make sure that you're sizing it to what you anticipate you're going to need. So one of the decision points with a cloud server is whether you're going to go with a single big server or go with multiple smaller servers. One thing that this particular customer decided to do is to have multiple servers, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later on. But Again, as I mentioned earlier, just like with undersizing an instance, you're not committed and stuck with that particular instance or that number of servers if it turns out that you need more later on. So be aware of it. Make sure that you size it reasonably accordingly to what your needs are. But otherwise, if you make the wrong choices in the beginning, you can recover from it. So this customer happened to decide that they were going to spin up multiple server instances, smaller ones rather than one big one. First server that they spun up was a development server. So it's just a little dual core CPU, a few gig of RAM, just basically enough to support Visual Studio, and enough hard disk space to hold multiple copies of the source code, as well as a couple of copies of the test data for development testing, unit testing. The next thing that they spun up was a UAT server. Still a relatively small machine. In fact, it was a little bit smaller in terms of, compared to the development server, because all it's going to do is house the Synergy DBRs and run the application. You didn't have to store the source code on there. You don't have to run Visual Studio. You don't have to compile on it. Once we started to go through the UAT process with their business analyst and a few folks at the customer's site, we decided to go ahead and start spinning up the production servers. They ended up spinning up about 5 production servers. 2 of those servers are acting as a switch. So users will log in and the switches will tell them which of the 3 production servers they're going to go to or they're going to be connected to based on load. So it definitely helps from a load balancing standpoint to do it that way. And again, they are, I would consider them kind of mid-level size machines, not great big honking ones. And then one of the last servers that they spun up is just a small server. It's probably going to be used by at most 1 or 2 of their users, used strictly for interfacing to their core application, as well as non-core applications, such as the SQL data warehouse that was part of their application. Most importantly, one of the servers that they spun up was a fairly hefty machine, lots of disk space. That's going to act and is acting as their data server. As I said, they've got 30 plus plants. Each one of those plants has their own set of data. So that data server is going to house all of those copies of data. And it's also where the Synergy license manager lives. So lots of disk space on there, lots of CPU, middling amount of memory, not a ton. But again, if we find the performance degrades, we can certainly change that. So these are all the things that you need to consider when you're determining costs. So let's talk about the actual migration process. The process started with us getting the customer code base. All new PSG engagements now, I think Sharon mentioned it in her presentation yesterday, include us storing the customer source code in a Git repository that we, PSG, provide. We'll keep that source code in there for the length of the project, and typically even a little bit after the project is completed, so that the customer has an opportunity to take their source code and put it in their own Git repository or other source control software. In order to rapidly move to the Windows, we needed to make minimal changes to their code. For this customer, their application is character cell-based, very old, and remains so in Windows. We'll actually see snapshots of it, how it looks in Windows. We do modify almost all the source code in order to add a UI class to it, just simply because that's the way that's the mechanism that allows us to be able to display and accept keyboard input within Windows. Like I said, the look and feel is going to be very familiar to the users because we didn't really change the look and feel at all. It looks just like a character cell based application running in Windows. The other major area of change is with printing. We actually added the ability to view, print, and obviously fax and email reports in PDF. That's through the Libharu product. Use of the VMS compatibility routines minimized a lot of the code changes. VMS compatibility is something that's available at the Synergex GitHub. I think it was talked about either last year or the year before also. One caveat about the VMS compatibility is that if your application is heavily dependent on open VMS routines, we have not ported over every single VMS routine. So we've ported over the ones that are probably going to be the most commonly used, and certainly the ones that we can port over. If you're using a lot of VMS security type of routines, there is no counterpart to things like permissions and rights in Windows. So if you've got that in your code and you're considering migrating your Open VMS application to Windows, I would highly suggest that that's the first thing that you tackle is to look at that and make sure that you get it in a shape where it's less dependent on those Open VMS routines. In addition to putting the source in Git, just about all of the recent PSG projects that we're involved in also get their source code put into Visual Studio. Now in this case, since they're migrating to Windows, it only makes sense to do that for them, but even if you're not in Windows, we'll put maybe some of your code in Visual Studio because it helps us. You know, it helps the developers because that's what we're familiar with, that's what we're efficient with. This particular migration also included Synergy licensing in the cloud. It's not the Rev 11 licensing that was talked about the other day, but you know, it is a license manager that's running, as I mentioned before, on their data server in conjunction with their data. So it's working just fine. Main production data is kept in that dedicated cloud server. We do have XF Server running on it, so that all of the application uses XF Server to get at the data. As I mentioned earlier, we actually took the code and created 3 Visual Studio solutions. And that's because they have slight differences between one region's code and another. The way that we set up the Visual Studio solutions, however, is that we reference the source files rather than having them reside within each solution. So if you make a change in one solution and that same source file is referenced in another solution, that other solution will pick it up. You'll still need to recompile, but it will pick it up. And as I mentioned, we use Git both for source control and for tracking any issues that we may have had either through development or UAT. I already mentioned about the security. Again, I can't emphasize it enough. If your application calls or uses Open VMS security concepts such as permissions and rights, that's something that you probably need to consider before you consider a migration. Minor decision point you might want to make for production deployment is whether the users access the application using remote desktop or remote application, and I'll show what the customer chose in this particular instance. Topic is a little bit big for this this presentation, but I believe it's been talked about before, or if you want to know a little bit more about it or the reason why we chose to go a certain way, let me know. But mainly when they went with remote application, and the thing about a remote application is that you can enforce that when a user logs in, they're not going to see the underlying windows that server is providing. They go directly into their login application, and that's where they stay until they log off. So they shouldn't be able to go into Explorer, for example, and delete files from underneath you. So what's our result? I was sort of hoping that by the time I gave this presentation that they'd be live. Unfortunately, there was a little bit of a hiccup in some of the process, and so customers actually postponed the go live date a little bit. And we're having to consider now whether it's going to work into their business because they do have a busy season and they're going to be going into their busy season soon. So we have, I think, one window of opportunity to go live, and if we miss that one, then we may have to wait until 2019 to go live on it. But what have we completed so far? We've instantiated their cloud servers, as I mentioned. Another thing I want to bring up and kind of reiterate is that by setting it up in such a way that there are multiple production servers and a load switch that is putting the user logins into the most available server, they've already put that infrastructure in place so that if they have to add on additional servers, all they need to do is just simply say, here's another server to add to the pool, and the switches will, just put them into that server. So it's a great load balancing and future-proofing concept that, if you put it in early, it's less of a headache going forward. The other result is that we have their application code base, builds and runs in Visual Studio, and is controlled in Git. The end user experience is going to be very close to their open VMS system. And while you look at it and you say, that's an ugly looking screen, it does help from the standpoint that the end user training is going to be substantially easier. They're going to see it, they're going to instantly recognize it, they're going to know how to navigate around. I don't think we changed a single key on this particular application. So they're going to use familiar keystrokes, just as they have in the past. Something that I didn't include in my presentation here, but is one of the tasks that came up towards the tail end of the project. So we actually got done, we PSG, with the milestones that were assigned to us. We got done on time, maybe a little bit early even. And so we had some available time while we waited for the customer to finish up with their milestones. And one of the things that came up was that the business analyst was having a tough go at doing training. He had picked a handful of users that he was going to start training on the new system, and he found it difficult to train these people on some of the things that are different with the system. Like I said, once you land in the application, everything looks the same. But getting to the application is different between their open VMS system and their Windows system. So I think we're good on time. Let me show you that video. Hopefully it all works. This is a video that we created.
If you will be accessing the NDS software through web access on your desktop, the first step you'll take is to launch a browser session. In the address bar, you'll type in the address, type in your domain and username and your password, and then click Sign In. Now you'll be presented with your available remote apps. Single-click the NDS login icon. If you are presented with a warning message about the remote app, click the checkbox for Don't Ask Me Again for remote connection from this publisher. Then click Connect to launch the remote app. This will take a few seconds to load. Once the user login screen appears, double-click the location you want to run, and you'll be presented with the NDS software.
It's something that we created for the customer because they realized that they had a need for it. We had some available time in the project, and in fact, I don't think we billed them for separately for this one. It was still within the scope of the entire project. So that's the other thing is that I don't know about now, but we were ahead of our estimation on this particular project. So we produced about half a dozen or so of those videos. They're very short, minute and a half. Very specific type things. To help them get their users up to speed. So here's that login screen that we saw a little bit of in the video there. So after the user logs in, this is the screen that they're presented with. Again, there's no Windows Explorer or anything like that they can see. Main reason for creating that login screen is to keep the windows from prying around where they shouldn't be. So the other thing that it does is it allows them to have a single login to access more than one company. So as you can see there, they've got multiple companies. This particular user only has access to 2 of the plants. Super users can have access to multiple, all 30 of their plants if need be. Also allows them to change colors of their application, foreground and background colors. And the primary reason for that is it makes it very easy to visually see which plant's data am I working on. They can also change fonts if need be. This was actually something that came about a little bit later on after somebody said the characters on the application are just too small. So that was something that we added. Because the customer is using a remote application, Windows and the corresponding programs are not generally available. So this program allows the user to access things like Snipping Tool and Task Manager. So those are the things that we said the user can have access to. And I think even with Task Manager, it's limited to only certain users that are capable of getting that button. The customer also currently uses macros. They're built into their terminal emulator. So in order to simulate that, we have this key logging function that allows you to record and then play back a set of keystrokes. And then sufficiently privileged users can also run as a different user. So I log in as me, but I've got this user that's having a problem that I can't replicate with my login. So you can run the application, the DBRs, using their login, and you can also enable debugging. And this is a couple of screenshots of their application. As you can see there in the upper left corner, they call it instance and branch names. So you can, in addition to the color, which the end user would set up, you can also see which particular plant's data that you happen to be looking at. Again, it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but the big positive with that is that their end users are going to instantly recognize it and be able to work with it. As I mentioned earlier, a key goal of ours was to keep our code changes in order to have this thing run in Windows to a minimum, so that again the customer or the application looks and behaves like the VMS version. So like I said, it's easy. Based on our recent experience, migrating from Open VMS to Windows Server on the cloud is an easy thing to do. As I said, I wish I could have reported now that the customer is live. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. However, to give you an idea of the timelines that we took, we kicked off this project in mid-December of 2017. A little after about a month or so, we had the code building in Visual Studio. I think we'd performed at least the first round of data conversions. After about 3 months, all the code changes that were required to get it to run in Windows. So we got it to build in Windows, but it wasn't going to run in Windows just yet. But after 3 months, we got all those changes completed so that it could actually run in Windows. And after about 6 months was when all the testing, at least the initial testing with their business analyst and a small group of users, was completed. They've got some non-core, programs that they still need to finish and test, but we think that within a matter of a week or so, that all should be ready. So we're hoping go live is imminent for these guys. Can I answer the first question?
Once in the application, can they use the mouse at all?
They can certainly use the mouse from the standpoint of moving the application window around, but again, you know, we stayed with a character cell base. That means it's going to be character cell base, and because of that, there's no mouse allowed within the application itself. You'll have the typical Windows cut and paste capabilities, but you know, you can't click on a field and automatically jump to that field. It's still character cell based. You still have to go play by the rules of the application itself. The question was, because it continues to be character cell based, what's it going to take to effort-wise to get you into a more Windows type environment? A lot of the base work has already been performed, mainly to get the code into Visual Studio. So once there, then you've got different avenues that you could certainly use. We have not started that discussion with this particular customer, but they're certainly aware that you know, the jump is much shorter now, you know, because that we've got their code in Visual Studio. I don't know how big of an effort that's going to be. It's gonna, I don't want to say insurmountable, because it is surmountable, but it's going to take some effort. You know, we don't want to you know, paint a rosy picture on that one. It's a very old piece of code. It's as you can see.
If the application was using Toolkit at all, I don't know if this is, but if it was, would it be then usable with the mouse at that level?
Thank you. According to Steve, yes. Yes. So if it had mouse capabilities, you know, in the native application in OpenVMS, then it should retain those. Right. Yeah. In this particular case, it is not Toolkit, but if it was, it would allow that. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kish.